On the 7th of June, 1494, in the small Spanish town of Tordesillas, representatives of two of the most powerful kingdoms on earth sat down and, with the stroke of a pen, divided the entire unexplored world between them. Everything west of an imaginary line drawn through the Atlantic Ocean would belong to Spain. Everything east of it would belong to Portugal. Entire continents neither side had ever seen, entire peoples who had no idea this meeting was even taking place, were carved up in a single afternoon between two Catholic crowns, and the document that gave them the religious authority to do it had been issued only months earlier by the reigning pope. That pope's name was Alexander VI. And by the time he authorized the treaty that would reshape the modern world, he had already made himself one of the most talked about, most feared, and most reviled men in all of Christendom, not principally for his statecraft, but for running the papacy itself as a family business. He was the second member of his family to sit on the throne of St. Peter in less than 40 years. His children held duchies. His daughters' marriages were arranged and dissolved like business contracts. His own son commanded armies, murdered rivals, and would go on to become the single most notorious political operator of the entire Italian Renaissance. A man so ruthlessly effective that a Florentine diplomat would use him within a few years as the literal blueprint for the most famous book on power ever written. Their name was Borgia, and nearly everything about how they're remembered, as poisoners, as schemers, as a family so corrupt they became a byword for depravity itself, is a story every bit as constructed and self-serving as the treaty that divided a world its authors had never even seen. This is the story of how a minor noble family from a small hilltop town in northern Spain produced two popes, redrew the map of the unexplored world, and became the single most notorious name of the Italian Renaissance. Not through inherited power, but through raw, patient, ruthless ambition, generation after generation. Before we get into how they did it, hit subscribe. There's a lot more of this kind of history coming, and you won't want to miss where this one goes. Now, picture the hill town of Borja in the Kingdom of Aragon, sometime in the early 1300s. A minor noble family works its modest estates, its name drawn, as so many were in this era, simply from the place it came from. Nothing about this family marks it out as destined for anything beyond local respectability. If you had told anyone standing in that town that this family's descendants would one day rule the Roman Catholic Church, command armies across Italy, and carve up an entire hemisphere between two kingdoms, would you have believed it? Let me know in the comments, and keep that question in mind, because the answer to how they got there is stranger than almost anything you could invent. The Borgias were not Italian. It is worth stating that plainly at the very beginning, because almost everything the popular imagination associates with this family, the poisoned rings, the marble palazzos, the whispered conspiracies of Renaissance Rome, obscures a simpler and, in its way, more interesting truth. The Borgias were Spanish. For the first century and a half of their documented history, they belonged to the Kingdom of Aragon, and their rise in Italy began not as the triumph of an established Italian dynasty, but as the extraordinary ascent of outsiders who had to build their power almost from nothing in a political world that never fully accepted them. Their name came from Borja, a hilltop town in the Kingdom of Aragon, roughly 350 kilometers from Barcelona. In the High Middle Ages, fixed hereditary surnames were not yet universal in the way we understand them today. People were often identified by their place of origin. A man might be known as John of Norwich or Bernard of Leon. Families from smaller towns followed the same pattern, taking their home as part of their name. The ancestors of the future Borgia family became known as de Borja, of Borja. The name would later be written as Borja in Spanish and rendered as Borgia in Italian, but the family behind it remained unmistakably Aragonese. Later generations would cultivate a more prestigious version of their ancestry. Family tradition claimed that the Borgias descended from King Ramiro I of Aragon, an 11th century monarch. There is no reliable evidence for this. It was almost certainly the kind of flattering ancestral tradition that becomes attractive to a family once it has acquired enough wealth and power to want a pedigree worthy of both. And that detail is worth remembering, because creating a more impressive version of their own story would become something of a Borgia habit. The documented founder of the branch that would eventually produce the great Borgia popes was Juan Domingo de Borja, who was born in Borja around the middle of the 14th century. He eventually moved into the Kingdom of Valencia, where he acquired an estate at La Torreta de Canals. There was nothing about his position that suggested the extraordinary future of his descendants. He was a provincial landowner in the Aragonese world, respectable but hardly powerful enough to make his family a major force in European politics. His son would change that. His name was Alfonso de Borja, and Alfonso would accomplish something no previous generation of the family had come close to achieving. He would take a relatively obscure Spanish family and carry its ambitions into the very center of Western Christendom. But that transformation did not happen in isolation. To understand how a family from Valencia could eventually rise inside the papal court, we first have to understand the political world surrounding them. Because the Borgia rise was not simply the product of one man's talent or ambition, it was also a product of timing. By the 14th century, Italy was not a unified country. The peninsula was divided among kingdoms, republics, duchies, and territories controlled by the Church. Powerful states such as Venice, Florence, Genoa, Milan, Naples, and the Papal States competed constantly for territory, wealth, and influence. And Italy had become a battleground for powers far beyond the peninsula itself. The Kingdom of Naples and Sicily, in particular, had spent generations caught between rival dynasties and foreign powers. Norman rulers had conquered southern Italy and Sicily. The Angevin dynasty later established itself in Naples, and in 1282, the Sicilian Vespers Revolt opened the door for the Crown of Aragon to intervene in Sicily. The resulting conflict eventually divided the Old Kingdom between two rival powers. The Aragonese controlled Sicily, while the Angevins retained Naples on the Italian mainland. That division would last for generations. Then, in the 15th century, the balance shifted again. Between 1435 and 1442, King Alfonso V of Aragon fought to conquer Naples. By 1442, he had succeeded. For the Crown of Aragon, this was a major strategic victory. For the Borgias, it created something even more important: a political bridge between their Spanish homeland and Italy. Valencia was no longer part of an isolated Spanish world whose affairs had little connection to Rome. Aragonese power now stretched directly into the Italian peninsula. Spanish nobles, merchants, soldiers, diplomats, and churchmen increasingly moved through the same Mediterranean world connecting Valencia, Sicily, Naples, and Rome. And Rome itself was not some distant abstraction. It was the headquarters of the papacy, one of the most powerful political institutions in Europe. A talented and ambitious man from the Kingdom of Valencia could now enter that world through networks created by the expanding influence of the Crown of Aragon. And one man was about to exploit that opportunity better than anyone in his family had before him. Alfonso de Borja. His rise would begin not on a battlefield and not in a palace, but inside the church. And from there, the obscure Borja family would begin its astonishing transformation into the Borgias of Renaissance Rome. Alonso de Borja was born at La Torreta de Canals to Juan Domingo de Borja and his wife, Francina, on the last day of December, 1378. His father's rise as a substantial local landholder gave the family enough standing to provide their son with an education far beyond what most provincial families could offer. Alonso was sent to the University of Lleida, one of the Crown of Aragon's respected centers of legal education. There, he studied law. But he also entered the church. To modern eyes, those two careers might seem unrelated. In 14th and 15th century Europe, they were anything but. The church was one of the largest institutions in Europe, and its senior officials were not merely religious figures. Bishops and other churchmen could serve as diplomats, lawyers, royal advisors, administrators, and political negotiators. For Alonso, combining legal training with a career in the clergy gave him access to two of the most powerful networks in Aragonese society, and he proved exceptionally good at using both. He eventually came to the attention of King Alfonso V of Aragon, entering royal service and rising steadily through the administration. By 1416, at 37 years old, Alonso had become the king's chief secretary. But he had entered public life at a particularly dangerous moment for Western Christianity. For decades, the Catholic Church had been divided by what became known as the Western Schism. Two rival popes, and at times three, claimed to be the legitimate head of the church. One line was based in Rome, another in Avignon, and the competing claims divided monarchs, bishops, universities, and entire kingdoms. The crisis was not simply theological, it was political. European rulers had to decide which pope they recognized, and those decisions often reflected alliances and national interests as much as religious conviction. Aragon had its own stake in the dispute, and Alonso became involved in the diplomacy surrounding it. He traveled and negotiated on behalf of the crown, working within the complicated efforts to restore unity to the church. The schism was eventually brought to an end at the Council of Constance, which elected Martin V in 1417. Alonso did not personally end the schism, but his experience in ecclesiastical diplomacy and his usefulness to the Aragonese monarchy continued to increase his standing. In 1429, Martin V appointed him Bishop of Valencia. It was a remarkable promotion. Alonso had risen from a provincial family to one of the most important ecclesiastical positions in the Kingdom of Aragon. And yet, his greatest opportunity was still ahead. The key was the man who had employed him for years, Alfonso V of Aragon. Alfonso had ambitions far beyond the Iberian Peninsula. He wanted Naples. The Kingdom of Naples had become the prize in a long struggle between the Aragonese and the Angevin dynasty, and in 1442, Alfonso finally conquered the kingdom and entered Naples in triumph. The victory dramatically changed the political position of the Crown of Aragon. It also changed Alonso de Borja's future. Alonso became increasingly useful as an intermediary between the Aragonese monarchy and the papacy, helping manage relations between Alfonso's new government in Naples and Pope Eugene IV. This was exactly the kind of work at which Alonso excelled: law, diplomacy, ecclesiastical politics, and royal service all operating at once. In 1444, Eugene IV made him a cardinal. Alonso was now 65 years old. He had spent decades climbing, and at an age when many men of his generation would have been thinking about retirement, he was entering the highest political circle of the Catholic Church. He gradually established himself in Italy, and with him came the first serious foundations of what would become the Borgia presence in Rome. Even the family's name began to change as it crossed linguistic boundaries. In Spanish, he was Alonso de Borja. In Italian usage, the name increasingly appeared as Alonso de Borgia. The transformation was more than spelling. The Borgias were becoming Borgias, and Rome was about to become their new political home. But the Rome Alonso entered was nothing like the magnificent Renaissance capital that later generations would imagine. It was a battered, relatively small city still recovering from centuries of political instability. the population had fallen dramatically from its ancient peak. Great Roman monuments stood damaged or partially buried, while much of the city's political life was dominated by powerful aristocratic families. Among the most influential were the Colonna and the Orsini. Their rivalries were not merely matters of prestige. They possessed estates, clients, armed retainers, and political networks capable of turning disputes over the papacy into genuine violence. A newly elected pope therefore had to navigate a political landscape in which powerful Roman families could be as dangerous as foreign kings. And into this world came a 65-year-old Spaniard. Alonso had no ancient Roman pedigree. He did not belong to the Colonna. He was not an Orsini. He had no generations-old network of Roman relatives waiting to protect him. At first glance, this should have been a weakness. Instead, it gave the Borgias something extremely valuable: freedom of movement. Because Alonso did not owe his position to one Roman faction, he could negotiate with several of them. He could deal with the Colonna without becoming their creature. He could negotiate with the Orsini without becoming their ally. And his existing connections to the Aragonese monarchy gave him another powerful network outside Rome itself. The Borgias were outsiders, but that did not necessarily make them powerless. It meant they were less constrained by the old loyalties that bound many Italian churchmen. And over the next several decades, the family would turn that outsider status into one of its greatest political advantages. By the time Alonso received his cardinal's hat, he was already an old man by the standards of his age. He reportedly presented his move to Italy to King Alfonso as little more than a retirement plan, a desire to spend his final years near the Holy City. Perhaps he genuinely believed that. If so, he was about to discover that his life was nowhere near finished. Because in 1455, something happened that almost no one in Rome expected. The elderly Spanish cardinal from a relatively obscure family was elected pope. And the name that emerged from the conclave was not Borgia. It was Calixtus III. The quiet retirement of Alonso de Borgia was about to become one of the most extraordinary political reversals in Renaissance Rome. On the 24th of March, 1455, Pope Nicholas V died. He left behind a church still shaken by one of the great catastrophes of the century, the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. The Byzantine Empire had disappeared. The Ottoman armies now stood firmly established on the European side of the Bosporus, and across Christian Europe, there was a growing fear that the Ottoman advance would not stop there. The next pope would inherit a church that was already thinking about war. The conclave that gathered to replace Nicholas was, from the beginning, genuinely contested. One of the leading candidates was Bessarion, a celebrated Greek scholar and cardinal who had converted to Catholicism and become one of the great intellectual figures of Renaissance Europe. But Bessarion faced a problem that had nothing to do with his abilities. He was Greek. For some of the cardinals, his Eastern origins made him an uncomfortable choice to lead a church still divided by centuries of tension between Latin and Greek Christianity. Meanwhile, the Italian cardinals had another problem. They did not want the papacy to fall under the domination of either of Rome's two great aristocratic factions, the Colonna or the Orsini. The rivalry between those families was deeply embedded in Roman politics. Choosing a pope too closely associated with either faction risked giving one of them a decisive advantage. So the cardinals looked for a compromise, and eventually, their attention turned toward a man who had not been considered the obvious favorite. An elderly Spanish cardinal from Valencia, Alonso de Borgia. He was 76 years old. He was not a Roman prince. He did not belong to one of the great Italian families. And precisely because he was an outsider, he could be acceptable to factions that distrusted one another. The cardinals elected him pope. He took the name Calixtus III. And with that single decision, the obscure Spanish family from Borja entered the highest office in Western Christianity. Calixtus would reign for only a little more than 3 years, from 1455 until his death in August 1458. His pontificate was dominated by one great objective: a crusade against the Ottoman Empire. The fall of Constantinople had transformed the Ottoman threat from a distant concern into an immediate European crisis. Calixtus tried to turn that fear into action. He called on Christian rulers to unite. He sent money and support toward the territories most directly threatened by the Ottoman advance, and he pushed European powers toward a new military expedition. There were successes. Hungarian forces, most famously, defeated an Ottoman army at Belgrade in 1456, a victory that temporarily halted Sultan Mehmed II's advance into Central Europe. But the grand coalition Calixtus imagined never truly materialized. Christian Europe remained divided by dynastic rivalries, territorial disputes, and competing political interests. The Pope could call for a crusade. He could not make Europe's rulers forget their own wars. Calixtus is also remembered for one of the strangest stories attached to any Renaissance pope. According to a famous later tale, when Halley's comet appeared in 1456, Calixtus supposedly ordered the comet to be excommunicated because it was an evil omen associated with the Ottoman Turks. It makes for a wonderful story. It is also almost certainly untrue. The story appears to have emerged decades after Calixtus's death, and there is no reliable evidence that he ever excommunicated the comet. The real story of his pontificate was considerably more consequential. Because while Calixtus was trying to organize a crusade against the Ottomans, he was also doing something that would shape European politics long after his death. He was building his family. One of the first beneficiaries was his nephew, Rodrigo de Borgia. Rodrigo had been born in Spain around 1431, the son of Isabel de Borja and Jofre Lansol. His father belonged to the wider Valencian nobility, but it was Rodrigo's maternal uncle who would transform the young man's prospects. Calixtus had already risen through the church before Rodrigo was old enough to understand what that meant. Now he could use that influence to open doors for his nephew. Rodrigo received ecclesiastical benefices while still young, and after his uncle's elevation to the papacy, his career accelerated dramatically. In 1456, Calixtus appointed the 25-year-old Rodrigo to the College of Cardinals. There is no need to soften what this was. It was nepotism. Calixtus had placed a member of his own family among the most powerful churchmen in Europe. But nepotism was not some uniquely Borgia invention. Renaissance popes routinely used family appointments to build networks of loyalty and political support. Later popes would do the same on an even greater scale. The difference with Rodrigo would be what he eventually did with the opportunity. Because the young man Calixtus had just elevated was not simply going to enjoy the privileges of being a cardinal. He was going to become exceptionally good at politics. Rodrigo and his brothers, Pedro Luis and Luis Juan, were brought into the Italian world that their uncle had entered before them. Rodrigo studied at the University of Bologna, where he received a legal education that complemented the ecclesiastical career being prepared for him. Like Alonso before him, Rodrigo was being trained for more than religious service. He was being prepared for power, and Calixtus continued to build that power. When he became pope, he relinquished several of the ecclesiastical offices he had previously held and distributed important positions and revenues among members of his family. Rodrigo received numerous benefices and became Bishop of Valencia. The diocese was later elevated to an archbishopric. The message was unmistakable. The family had not abandoned Spain simply because Alonso had moved to Rome. The Borgias were establishing themselves on both sides of the Mediterranean. Their estates and connections in Aragon remained important, but Rome was becoming the center of their ambitions, and Rodrigo was becoming the family's most important political asset. When Calixtus III died in 1458, his papacy had not created a lasting crusading coalition or transformed the church. But he had accomplished something that would prove far more consequential for the history of his own family. He had planted the Borgia name firmly in Rome, and he had given his nephew Rodrigo a position from which he could spend the next 4 decades accumulating something even more valuable than land or titles: power. Rodrigo was only 27, his uncle was dead, and the young cardinal now had to survive in a Rome that had no particular reason to love the Spanish family that had suddenly risen into its highest political circles. He would not merely survive, he would eventually become one of the most powerful men in Europe. And in 1492, almost 4 decades after his uncle's death, Rodrigo de Borgia would finally sit where Alonso had sat before him, on the throne of St. Peter. For more than 3 decades after his uncle's death, Rodrigo de Borgia built one of the most successful careers in the entire College of Cardinals. He accumulated offices, wealth, ecclesiastical revenues, and political influence under successive popes, gradually establishing himself as one of the richest and most indispensable churchmen in Rome. And he did it methodically. That is important because the Rodrigo who would eventually become infamous as Pope Alexander VI was not, during these decades, some reckless young adventurer throwing himself blindly into politics. He was patient. He was calculating. And above all, he understood that in Renaissance, Rome, power was rarely seized all at once. It was accumulated. Rodrigo's most important position was the vice-chancellorship of the Holy Roman Church, which he held from 1457 until his election to the papacy in 1492. For 35 years, he occupied one of the most important administrative offices in the Church. The vice-chancellor was deeply involved in the machinery through which the papacy governed. Papal documents, appointments, legal matters, ecclesiastical privileges, dispensations, and the enormous flow of business passing through the Roman Curia. That meant Rodrigo was not simply present at the center of power. He was part of the machinery that produced it. And over 3 decades, that gave him something more valuable than ceremonial prestige. It gave him relationships. A bishop whose appointment had been supported by Rodrigo remembered it. A churchman whose case had moved smoothly through the Curia remembered it. A noble family that had received a favor remembered it. A man who had needed money and found a wealthy cardinal willing to provide it remembered it. Rodrigo accumulated these connections year after year across successive pontificates. He also accumulated benefices. He held bishoprics, abbeys, and other ecclesiastical revenues across Spain and Italy, creating a financial empire that eventually made him enormously wealthy enough to live on a scale more commonly associated with princes than churchmen. His fortune gave him another source of power. Money could finance political alliances. Money could maintain households. Money could support relatives. Money could purchase loyalty. And money could make a cardinal extremely difficult to marginalize. Yet Rodrigo remained, in an important sense, an outsider. Rome's great Italian families measured their influence in generations. The Colonna, the Orsini, and other aristocratic houses possessed networks of relatives, clients, estates, and long-standing alliances that had existed long before Rodrigo arrived from Spain. Rodrigo could never simply inherit such a faction. So he built something different. He built a network of obligations. He could not offer his allies an ancient Roman surname. He could offer them access. He could offer money. He could offer appointments. He could offer favors. And after 30 years in the Curia, there were few people in Rome who could afford to pretend that Rodrigo did not matter. By the time Pope Innocent VIII lay dying in the summer of 1492, Rodrigo was no longer simply the wealthy Spanish cardinal who had benefited from his uncle's nepotism. He was one of the most experienced political operators in the College of Cardinals. But there was another side to his life that was considerably harder to reconcile with his position as a senior churchman. Rodrigo was openly living a life that violated the celibacy expected of a cardinal. He maintained relationships with women for decades. The most important was Vanozza de Catane, a Roman woman who became the mother of several of Rodrigo's children and remained closely connected to him for many years. Together they had 4 children, whose parentage is generally accepted by historians: Cesare, born in 1475, Giovanni, born in 1476, Lucrezia, born in 1480, and Geoffrey, born around 1481. Rodrigo could not openly present them as his children without making his violation of clerical celibacy impossible to conceal. So they were initially described publicly as his nieces and nephews. It was an obvious fiction. But Renaissance Rome was full of arrangements that everyone understood and few people discussed openly. And Rodrigo's private life did not prevent his political career from advancing. There were probably other children as well. A daughter named Girolama is generally believed to have been Rodrigo's, although her mother's identity is uncertain. Then there is the extraordinary case of the child known as the Infans Romanus, or Roman child, born in 1498. His parentage remains disputed. Documents associated with the Borgia family eventually attributed him to different combinations of the family, and historians have proposed Rodrigo, Cesare, or even Lucrezia as possible parents. The evidence is too uncertain to treat any one explanation as established fact. What is clear is that Rodrigo fathered several children despite having taken vows that formally required celibacy, and remarkably, the scandal did little to stop his rise. That tells us something important about Renaissance Rome. The Church's official ideals and the behavior of many of the men who governed it could exist in uncomfortable proximity. What mattered politically was not whether Rodrigo's private life was morally defensible. What mattered was whether he remained useful, wealthy, connected, and powerful. And Rodrigo was all for. He had also been thinking about the papacy for years. His uncle had done it. Rodrigo intended to do it too. His first serious opportunity came in 1484, when Pope Sixtus IV died. Rodrigo entered the conclave as one of the leading figures, but he faced a formidable rival, Giuliano della Rovere, a powerful cardinal and nephew of the recently deceased pope. Neither man could secure enough support to dominate the election. So once again, the cardinals chose a compromise. The winner was Giovanni Battista Cibo, who became Pope Innocent VIII. Rodrigo had lost. But he had learned something important. He now knew exactly how the conclave worked. He knew which cardinals could be persuaded. He knew which families mattered. He knew where money could influence a decision. And he knew which rivals stood between him and the papal throne. He would have another opportunity. He would not have to wait very long. Because 8 years later, in the summer of 1492, Innocent VIII died. And this time, Rodrigo de Borgia was no longer an outsider hoping for a miracle. He had spent 35 years preparing for the moment when the papacy became available. The question was no longer whether Rodrigo wanted the throne. It was whether he could buy, bargain, persuade, or outmaneuver enough cardinals to take it. Pope Innocent VIII died on July 25, 1492. 2 weeks later, the cardinals entered conclave to choose his successor. What followed would become one of the most controversial papal elections in the history of the Church. It was also the first conclave ever held inside the Sistine Chapel. the great chapel whose ceiling would later become synonymous with Michelangelo. 23 cardinals entered. Almost none expected Rodrigo de Borgia to emerge as pope. The early speculation centered on several more obvious candidates. One was Ascanio Sforza, younger brother of Ludovico Sforza, the powerful ruler of Milan and one of the most formidable political figures in northern Italy. Another was Giuliano della Rovere, nephew of the late Pope Sixtus IV. Della Rovere was ambitious, fiercely political, and had spent years positioning himself for the papacy. He would eventually become Pope Julius II, and once Rodrigo became Alexander VI, one of the most determined enemies the Borgias would ever face. Before the conclave even began, foreign ambassadors were sending their government's predictions about who would win. Rodrigo was not generally considered the favorite, and on paper, that made sense. He was Spanish, he was controversial, he had accumulated enormous wealth, and his long career in the Curia had created plenty of rivals. But the cardinals faced a problem that was more important than Rodrigo's reputation. Arithmetic. Della Rovere and the Sforza faction represented competing political interests, and neither could easily gather the two-thirds majority required for election. The more obvious candidates began to cancel one another out, and that created an opening. Rodrigo understood something his rivals were slower to appreciate. A conclave did not necessarily produce the man everyone wanted most. It produced the man enough cardinals could agree to accept. And Rodrigo had spent 35 years preparing for precisely this kind of negotiation. He had money, he had offices, he had benefices, he had allies. And he knew the cardinals personally. He also knew what they wanted. While rival factions maneuvered around one another, Rodrigo could offer something extremely concrete in return for support. He could offer positions, he could offer influence, he could offer access to the enormous patronage system surrounding the papacy. In other words, the other candidates were negotiating with promises. Rodrigo was negotiating with things he already controlled. The conclave began on August 6th. The voting did not immediately produce a winner. Then, as the deadlock became clearer, one of Rodrigo's most important rivals made a decision. Ascanio Sforza switched his support to Rodrigo. The precise circumstances remain controversial. A contemporary chronicler, Stefano Infessura, later claimed that Rodrigo sent 4 mule loads of silver to Sforza's palace in exchange for his support. It is one of the most famous stories associated with the election. It is also one of the details historians treat cautiously. Infessura was openly hostile toward Rodrigo, and the dramatic image of mules carrying silver through the streets of Rome has never been independently established. But the broader reality is much harder to dismiss. Sforza received substantial rewards for supporting Rodrigo, including the coveted office of Vice-Chancellor of the Holy Roman Church, the position Rodrigo himself had held for more than 3 decades, along with the Palazzo Borgia and other valuable properties and revenues. Whether contemporaries described such arrangements as bribery, patronage, or simply the political bargaining of a Renaissance conclave, the distinction did little to change how the election was remembered. Critics soon circulated a bitter saying about the new pope, that he had bought the papacy and therefore had every right to sell it. The precise wording varied. The sentiment did not. On August 11, 1492, Rodrigo de Borgia was elected pope. He took the name Alexander VI. Rome had a new pope, and the man who had entered the conclave as an outsider had outmaneuvered cardinals with deeper Italian roots, older family connections, and ambitions of their own. A Venetian ambassador soon reported that the election had been accompanied by simony and what he described as 1,000 villainies, predicting that both Spain and France would eventually regret the result. Whether every accusation was true is another question. But the perception mattered. Alexander VI began his pontificate under a cloud of suspicion that would follow him for the rest of his life. And yet, there was an important complication. Alexander was not simply an incompetent or chaotic man who had somehow stumbled onto the papal throne. He was 61 years old. He had spent more than 3 decades managing the machinery of the church. And in the early months of his pontificate, contemporary observers could point to real administrative achievements. He worked to restore order in Rome, strengthened law enforcement, and attempted to impose greater control over a city where violence and aristocratic disorder had become serious problems under Innocent VIII. For a brief moment, there was a possibility that Alexander VI might prove to be a capable and comparatively conventional Renaissance pope. That possibility would not last. Because Rodrigo de Borgia had not spent decades accumulating wealth, political connections, and influence simply to become pope. He had a family. He had children. And now, for the first time, he possessed something his uncle had never enjoyed on the same scale: the full power of the papacy at his disposal. Alexander VI intended to use that power, not merely to enrich himself, not merely to protect his children, but to transform them into a political dynasty. And that ambition would take the Borgias far beyond the politics of the Vatican. It would draw them into the wars of Italy, into the rivalries of Europe's great monarchies, and into one of the most extraordinary attempts at dynastic state-building ever undertaken by a pope. The age of the Borgias had truly begun. Within months of his election, Alexander VI moved with a speed and openness that shocked even a Roman political class thoroughly accustomed to papal nepotism. Other popes had favored a nephew here, granted a benefice there, or elevated a relative to an important office. Alexander was attempting something more ambitious, and you can see it most clearly by watching the pieces fall into place one after another. First came the public recognition of his children. Then came the offices, placed in the hands of sons who were barely adults. Then came the marriages, not romantic matches, but political treaties binding Borgia children to ruling houses. Then came the territories. And eventually, the armies needed to defend them. Viewed separately, each decision could be dismissed as another example of Renaissance nepotism. Viewed together, they revealed something much more ambitious. Alexander was trying to turn his family into a hereditary political dynasty. A dynasty needed a recognized bloodline. It needed wealth. It needed offices and titles. It needed powerful marriage alliances. It needed territory. And ultimately, it needed soldiers. Alexander possessed something no ordinary Italian family could match. He was pope. The papacy could provide legitimacy, money, ecclesiastical offices, diplomatic recognition, and, when necessary, the political authority to justify territorial claims. Alexander therefore had an extraordinary instrument at his disposal. The question was how far he could use it before the rest of Italy decided that the Borgias had become too powerful to tolerate. His children were at the center of the project. Cesare, only 17 when his father became pope, was appointed Archbishop of Valencia within weeks of Alexander's election. The appointment was extraordinary. Valencia was not some minor provincial church. It was the same prestigious see associated with Alonso de Borja and Rodrigo himself. And now it belonged to a 17-year-old. Cesare had little obvious interest in becoming a conventional churchman. But the position gave him something more important than a religious career: income, status, and a platform from which his father could continue building his future. In 1493, Cesare was made a cardinal. He was 18. The irony would become increasingly obvious. The church had given Cesare a cardinal's hat, but the talents he would eventually become famous for had little to do with theology. He was intelligent, ambitious, politically calculating, and increasingly fascinated by power outside the church. For the moment, however, he remained one of Alexander's most valuable pieces. His brother Giovanni was being prepared for a completely different role. Alexander secured for him the title Duke of Gandia, a hereditary title in the Kingdom of Valencia, and arranged a prestigious marriage to Maria Enriquez, a member of the Spanish royal family. Giovanni was therefore being groomed as the family's secular heir. Where Cesare was being pushed toward the church, Giovanni was being prepared to carry the Borgia name through hereditary territory, marriage, and military power. It was a deliberate division of roles. One son would rise through the church, the other would build the family's secular dynasty. The distinction would become tragically important. Then there was Lucrezia. She was only 12 when her father became pope, but Alexander quickly recognized the political value of his daughter. Lucrezia had been raised partly in the household of her mother, Vanozza de Catane, and received an unusually sophisticated education for a young woman of her position. She learned languages, literature, music, and courtly culture. She was intelligent and well-educated. But none of that meant she would control her own future. For a Renaissance dynasty, a daughter could be one of the most valuable diplomatic instruments available. In 1493, at about 13 years old, Lucrezia was married to Giovanni Sforza, a member of the powerful Sforza family. The marriage strengthened the Borgias' connection with Milan, and, just as importantly, linked Alexander's family to the same political world represented by Ascanio Sforza, one of the men who had helped Rodrigo win the papacy. Lucrezia's own wishes mattered little. The marriage was a political arrangement, and it would eventually collapse under circumstances that would generate one of the most persistent scandals of the Borgia era. The youngest child, Geoffrey, was still only a boy when Alexander began arranging his future. He was married to Sancha of Aragon, a granddaughter of King Alfonso II of Naples. Once again, the logic was political. The Borgias were connecting themselves to another ruling dynasty: Milan, Naples, Spain. And at the center of all three relationships stood the Pope. Within little more than a year, Alexander had placed his children into positions connecting the Borgia family with some of the most important dynasties in Italy and the wider Mediterranean. But this was not happening in a stable Italy. A crisis was already approaching. In 1494, King Charles VIII of France invaded Italy. His immediate objective was the Kingdom of Naples, which the French king claimed through a dynastic connection to the Angevin rulers who had once controlled the kingdom. But Charles was not merely bringing a diplomatic claim. He was bringing an army, a very large one. The Italian states had spent generations fighting one another, balancing Milan against Venice, Florence against its rivals, Naples against Rome. Now they faced something different. A major European monarchy had entered the peninsula with overwhelming military force. The French army crossed the Alps and moved rapidly south. Italian resistance collapsed with astonishing speed. Charles entered Florence. He marched toward Rome, and Alexander suddenly found himself facing a foreign army that he could not defeat militarily. The French reached Rome in late 1494. Alexander was effectively trapped. The Pope could not simply fight the French king. He had to survive him. So Alexander did what he had repeatedly demonstrated he was good at. He negotiated. He reached an accommodation with Charles, allowing the French army to pass through Rome while securing guarantees for his own safety and the security of the papal government. But Alexander had no intention of allowing Charles to dominate Italy. While the French army continued south toward Naples, Alexander helped encourage the formation of a broader Italian coalition against the invasion. The result was the League of Venice, formed in 1495 by several major European and Italian powers determined to contain French expansion. Charles's conquest of Naples began to unravel. By the end of 1495, the French king had been forced to retreat north. The crisis was over. But the lesson remained. The French invasion had demonstrated something terrifying to every ruler in Italy. The peninsula was vulnerable. The old balance between Italian states could not guarantee protection against a determined foreign monarchy. Diplomacy could buy time. Treaties could create alliances. But ultimately, survival depended on something more tangible: land, money, and soldiers. Alexander understood this. If the Borgias were going to become a genuine political dynasty, they could not depend forever on marriages and papal appointments. They needed a territorial base of their own. They needed an army capable of conquering and holding it. And that created a problem. Alexander had already designated Giovanni as the family's secular heir. Giovanni had the title, he had the marriage, he had the Spanish connections. He was supposed to be the Borgia who built the family's territorial power. But history had other plans, because the son who had been dressed for the church would prove far more capable of building a state: Cesare Borgia. And once Cesare discovered what he was capable of doing with an army behind him, the Borgia family's ambitions would enter an entirely new and much more dangerous phase. Before this documentary follows Cesare Borgia's transformation from cardinal into soldier, one conflict from these same years deserves its own highlights, because it reveals a very different side of Alexander VI's papacy. This time, the battlefield was not a province of Italy. It was a pulpit. And the man standing behind it would become one of the most dangerous critics the Borgia Pope ever faced. His name was Girolamo Savonarola. Savonarola was a Dominican friar who had spent years preaching in Florence, denouncing what he saw as the moral corruption of Italian society and, increasingly, the corruption of the church itself. His message was apocalyptic. He warned that Italy was facing divine punishment. He condemned luxury, sexual immorality, greed, political corruption, and what he regarded as the spiritual decay of the clergy. And after Rodrigo Borgia became pope in 1492, Savonarola's criticism increasingly focused on the man sitting on the throne of St. Peter. Alexander VI was almost the perfect symbol for everything Savonarola hated. A pope surrounded by wealth. A pope openly promoting his relatives. A pope whose children were being placed into positions of political power. And a pope whose election had been followed by widespread accusations of simony. Savonarola's influence exploded during the political chaos created by the French invasion of Italy in 1494. The Medici were driven from Florence. The old political order collapsed. And Savonarola emerged as one of the most influential voices in the city. He preached to enormous crowds. His followers believed that he was a prophet, warning Florence of divine judgment. And he did not merely speak from the pulpit. He helped shape the political and moral culture of Florence itself. His followers attacked gambling, luxury, prostitution, extravagant clothing, and other practices they regarded as sinful. Then, in 1497, came the event that would make Savonarola's movement internationally notorious: the bonfire of the vanities. In Florence, objects regarded as sinful or morally corrupting, including luxury goods, cosmetics, gambling equipment, and works of art, were collected and burned in a spectacular public ceremony. It was a dramatic demonstration of Savonarola's power. But the real danger for Alexander was not the bonfire. It was the message behind it. Savonarola was no longer simply telling people to live more morally. He was publicly challenging the legitimacy of the man who claimed to lead the entire Catholic Church. He accused Alexander of corruption. He condemned the worldly behavior of the Roman clergy. And he questioned the legitimacy of the Pope's election itself. That last accusation was particularly dangerous. Alexander's election had already been surrounded by accusations that votes had been purchased. Now, one of Italy's most influential preachers was telling a mass audience that the man occupying the papal throne might not possess legitimate spiritual authority at all. This was a different kind of enemy. A cardinal could be rewarded. A noble could be negotiated with. A political rival could sometimes be bought. Savonarola could not. His authority came from his congregation, and his followers believed that he was speaking for God. Alexander initially tried persuasion. He summoned Savonarola to Rome. At one point, the possibility of granting him a cardinal's hat was raised. Savonarola refused. The confrontation escalated. Alexander eventually ordered him to stop preaching, but Savonarola continued. The Pope then imposed increasingly severe restrictions on him. Finally, in 1497, Savonarola was formally excommunicated. In theory, that should have ended his religious authority. It did not. Savonarola continued to preach. His followers continued to listen. And the episode exposed something deeply uncomfortable for Alexander. A papal command could control men who depended upon the church for offices, money, and status. But it was much harder to control a man who believed that obeying the Pope would mean betraying God. For months, the confrontation continued, but Savonarola's position was weakening. His movement had demanded extraordinary sacrifices from Florence. His attacks on luxury and entertainment had alienated people who had initially supported him. Political opponents inside the city were becoming increasingly confident, and the miraculous signs Savonarola had predicted did not materialize. His authority began to erode. Then came the event that finally broke him. In 1498, Savonarola agreed to a trial by ordeal involving fire, a spectacle intended to prove the divine legitimacy of his movement. The event collapsed into confusion and never took place. Public support evaporated. Florentine authorities arrested Savonarola and two of his fellow Dominican followers, Domenico da Pescia and Silvestro Maruffi. They were subjected to interrogation and torture. Savonarola eventually confessed to charges of heresy and other offenses, although he later retracted portions of his confession. The church's authorities then condemned him. On 23 May 1498, Savonarola was taken to the Piazza della Signoria in Florence. There, he and his two companions were hanged. Their bodies were then burned. The authorities wanted to prevent their remains from becoming relics, around which a new cult could form. The man who had once commanded enormous crowds in Florence was gone. Alexander VI had defeated one of his most formidable ideological opponents, but it would be misleading to portray the execution as something Alexander simply ordered and Florence mechanically carried out. The Florentine government had its own reasons for destroying Savonarola. His enemies inside the city had been waiting for an opportunity to remove him, and the papacy's pressure helped create the legal and political environment in which that became possible. What Alexander had demonstrated was something slightly more important. He had shown that when a powerful figure challenged papal authority, he was willing to apply that authority relentlessly. Savonarola had attacked the legitimacy of Alexander's papacy. Alexander had responded with excommunication, political pressure, and the full weight of the church behind him. And the confrontation ended with Savonarola dead. But there was an irony in the story. Alexander had spent years building a family whose behavior Savonarola had condemned as evidence of everything wrong with the Renaissance church. Now that critic was gone. The Borgia project could continue. And Alexander's next challenge would not come from a preacher in Florence. It would come from much closer to home. Because while Savonarola was fighting Alexander over the soul of the church, Alexander was preparing his own children for a very different kind of struggle. And among them, Cesare Borgia was beginning to realize that the cardinal's hat his father had given him might be the one thing standing between him and the future he actually wanted. By 1497, Lucrezia Borgia's marriage to Giovanni Sforza had outlived its political usefulness. When the marriage had been arranged 4 years earlier, it had served an obvious purpose. The Borgias were strengthening their connection to the powerful Sforza family of Milan. But politics had changed. Alexander's priorities were shifting. and the alliance with Milan was no longer as valuable as it had once been. Giovanni Sforza himself was not the great political figure his surname might suggest. He belonged to the Sforza dynasty, but his own position was relatively limited. To Alexander, the marriage had become less an asset than an obstacle. He wanted it ended, and he wanted Lucrezia free to make a more advantageous match. There was, however, a serious legal problem. A marriage could not simply be dissolved because a pope had changed his political priorities. Church law recognized specific grounds for declaring a marriage invalid. One of the most useful possibilities in this case was the claim that the marriage had never been consummated. If that could be established, the marriage could be declared invalid on the grounds of impotence. And so Giovanni Sforza was placed in an extraordinary position. To end the marriage, he was effectively being asked to acknowledge publicly that he was incapable of consummating it. He refused, and understandably so. The accusation was not merely humiliating. For a Renaissance nobleman, it was an attack on his masculinity, his honor, and potentially his political future. But Giovanni was not confronting the Pope on equal terms. Alexander controlled the machinery of the church, and Giovanni's own Sforza relatives had little interest in turning a marital dispute into a full-scale confrontation with the most powerful churchman in Italy. Eventually, Sforza agreed to the annulment, but before doing so, he fought back in the most damaging way available to him. He began spreading a different explanation for Alexander's determination to end the marriage. According to the accusation, the Pope did not simply want Lucrezia free for another political alliance. He wanted her for himself. The claim was explosive, and it quickly became something even darker. Alexander's enemies expanded the story into rumors that the Pope and his son Cesare were both engaged in incestuous relationships with Lucrezia. There is no credible evidence establishing these accusations as fact. They belong to the enormous body of hostile Borgia propaganda that accumulated around the family during and after Alexander's reign. But the rumors spread because they were politically useful. The Borgias had become extraordinarily powerful. They had enemies everywhere. They had wealth that provoked resentment. They had political ambitions that threatened established Italian families. And they had given their enemies something even more valuable: a family whose private behavior could be turned into a weapon against its political legitimacy. The uglier the story, the easier it was to believe. And once such rumors entered circulation, they became almost impossible to kill. The annulment was finally granted in December 1497. The official grounds were Sforza's alleged impotence and the claim that the marriage had never been consummated. Sforza later denied the accusation and insisted that he was perfectly capable of consummating the marriage. The humiliation remained with him. Lucrezia, meanwhile, was free. She was not yet 18 years old. Her first marriage had been arranged for political reasons, destroyed for political reasons, and surrounded by accusations that would follow her reputation for centuries. But it would not be her last political marriage. And, in retrospect, it would be one of the least dangerous marriages she would ever enter. Because while Alexander was dismantling Lucrezia's first marriage, another crisis was unfolding inside the Borgia household, and this one could not be solved by an annulment. In June 1497, Alexander's second son, Giovanni Borgia, Duke of Gandia, disappeared after leaving a banquet in Rome. By the following day, his body would be found in the Tiber. The Borgia family's carefully constructed dynasty had suffered its first great internal catastrophe. And almost immediately, one question began to consume Rome. Who had killed the Pope's son? To understand why Giovanni Borgia's death shook Rome so violently, it helps to understand what he represented inside his own family. Giovanni had been given the future that Cesare wanted. Cesare had been handed a cardinal's robes and pushed toward a career in the church. Giovanni had been given a dukedom. He had been married into the Spanish aristocracy. He was being prepared for military command. He was the son Alexander had designated to build the family's secular power. The distinction was deliberate. Cesare would serve the church. Giovanni would serve the dynasty. And yet the two brothers were very different men. Giovanni was generally regarded as charming and sociable, although not especially disciplined or politically formidable. His position rested heavily on his father's favor and his birth within the family. Cesare, by contrast, was widely recognized as intelligent, ambitious, and exceptionally capable. He had the political instincts his father valued, but those talents were trapped inside a career he increasingly despised. That imbalance would become crucial after Giovanni's death. It also helps explain why the rumors surrounding the murder focused so quickly on Cesare. Rome did not need proof. It only needed to look at the two brothers and ask a simple question: who stood to gain? On the evening of the 14th, June 1497, Giovanni had dinner with Cesare at the home of their mother, Vanozza dei Catanei, in Rome. Nothing about the evening initially appeared unusual. The brothers left together afterward. And then Giovanni disappeared. He failed to return to his residence. When the absence continued into the following day, concern began to spread. At first, there was no immediate assumption of murder. Giovanni had a reputation for enjoying Rome's nightlife, and people could reasonably imagine that he had simply spent the night elsewhere. But by the following day, the situation had changed completely. A timber merchant came forward with a disturbing account. He claimed that on the night Giovanni disappeared, he had seen men in a small boat throw a body into the Tiber. The story was alarming enough to trigger a search. Boatmen were sent into the river, and they found Giovanni. The body showed clear signs of violence. He had suffered multiple stab wounds, including a fatal wound to the throat. His purse was still on him, containing money. This immediately made ordinary robbery an unlikely explanation. Whoever had killed the Duke of Gandia had not been interested in his money. They had wanted Giovanni himself. For Alexander VI, the news was devastating. Whatever else can be said about Alexander's politics, contemporary accounts describe his reaction as one of profound grief. He withdrew from public life for a period. He wept. He reportedly refused food. And, in the aftermath, he spoke publicly about the need for reform within the church. For a brief moment, the Pope, who had spent years accumulating wealth and power, seemed to confront the consequences of the world around him. The moment did not last. But the murder itself remained. And so did the question: who killed Giovanni Borgia? There was no shortage of suspects. The Orsini had long been rivals of the Borgias. Giovanni had enemies of his own. And Giovanni Sforza, humiliated by the collapse of his marriage to Lucrezia, had obvious reasons to resent the Borgia family. There were also other political factions with reasons to fear or hate the Pope's son. And then there was Cesare. The brothers had been together shortly before Giovanni disappeared. Cesare had a clear motive in theory. If Giovanni remained alive, he was the family's secular heir. If Giovanni died, the path toward secular power became dramatically more open for Cesare. The rumor therefore spread with astonishing speed. Cesare had killed his brother. The accusation became one of the defining stories of Borgia history. But there is a crucial distinction between what Rome believed and what the evidence proves. There is no surviving contemporary evidence that establishes Cesare as Giovanni's killer. No confession, no reliable eyewitness account, no document ordering the murder, no physical evidence. The case against Cesare is circumstantial. Motive existed. Opportunity existed. But so did a long list of other possible motives and suspects. And the mystery became even deeper because Alexander's investigation was abruptly abandoned. The Pope initially appeared determined to discover who had murdered his son. Then, only days later, he ordered the investigation stopped. He never provided a completely satisfactory public explanation. That decision has fueled speculation ever since. Perhaps Alexander learned something that convinced him the murder could never be solved. Perhaps political considerations made further investigation too dangerous. Perhaps he feared that exposing the killer would destabilize alliances the papacy desperately needed. Or perhaps, as later historians have speculated, he discovered evidence pointing towards someone within his own family and chose to protect the surviving son. But that last possibility remains exactly that: a possibility. It cannot be established as fact. What can be established is that the murder transformed the Borgia family. The carefully designed division between the two brothers had collapsed. Giovanni was dead. The secular position he had occupied was suddenly vacant, and Cesare was still wearing a cardinal's robes. The irony was almost unbearable. The son who had never wanted the church was now the obvious candidate to inherit the political future his younger brother had been prepared to build. Within months, Cesare began moving toward the decision that would change his life. He would abandon the church. He would remove the cardinal's hat, and he would pursue the military and political career that Giovanni had been groomed to lead. That timing has inevitably encouraged the darkest interpretation of the murder. To later generations, it could look almost too convenient. But history does not give us the final piece of evidence. We do not know who killed Giovanni Borgia. What we do know is what happened afterward. The Pope's favorite son was dead. The Borgia family's secular succession had been thrown open, and the son who had been forced into the church suddenly found the path toward everything he had wanted, lying directly in front of him. Cesare Borgia was about to become a soldier. In August 1498, Cesare Borgia did something extraordinary. He resigned the cardinal's hat. No cardinal had voluntarily abandoned the office under circumstances quite like these. Cesare was giving up one of the most powerful positions in the church, with his father's full approval, to pursue an entirely secular life. And the decision revealed something that had been becoming increasingly obvious. The church had never been where Cesare's ambitions truly lay. Cesare had spent almost his entire adult life trapped inside a role chosen for him by his family. His father had made him Archbishop of Valencia at 17 and a cardinal at 18, not because Cesare had demonstrated any particular religious vocation, but because Alexander needed one son inside the church, while another was being prepared to carry the family's secular ambitions. Birth order had assigned Cesare the robes. Giovanni had received the sword, and Cesare had been forced to watch his younger brother inherit everything he wanted: a dukedom, a prestigious marriage, military command, and the prospect of building a hereditary Borgia dynasty outside the church. He could not marry. He could not openly command armies. He could not establish a territorial state of his own. He could only wait. And waiting did not appear to suit Cesare's temperament. Giovanni's murder did not create Cesare's ambition. It removed the person occupying the position that ambition had always been intended to fill. Now Cesare could finally leave the church, and his father was already preparing the way. The opportunity came from France. In 1498, King Charles VIII died without surviving children, and his successor, Louis XII, needed a papal favor. Louis wanted his existing marriage annulled so that he could marry Anne of Brittany, securing the succession and strengthening his position. Alexander VI agreed to grant the annulment, but the Pope wanted something in return. France would support Cesare Borgia's transformation into a secular prince. Cesare traveled to France later that year. Louis XII granted him the title Duke of Valentinois, giving rise to the name by which he would become famous across Italy, Il Valentino. But a title alone was not enough. Cesare needed a powerful marriage. He married Charlotte d'Albret, sister of the King of Navarre, and a woman closely connected to the French royal family. The marriage was political from the beginning, just as virtually every major Borgia marriage had been. But it produced a daughter, Louise, before Cesare's ambitions drew him back toward Italy. France had given Cesare something the Church never could: a military and political platform from which to build a state of his own. And that state would not be built in France. It would be built in Italy. In 1499, Cesare returned to the peninsula with French military backing and a brutally straightforward objective: to carve a territorial principality out of the fractured lands of the Romagna. The region was technically under papal authority. In practice, however, it was divided among a collection of small lordships, fortified towns, and local rulers whose authority was often weak, contested, or deeply unpopular. Cesare intended to change that. He would spend the next 3 years conquering those territories one by one. He would recruit soldiers, break alliances, besiege cities, betray some enemies, negotiate with others, and eliminate anyone who stood between him and the state he was trying to build. In an astonishingly short period of time, the former cardinal would transform himself into something almost unrecognizable: a prince with an army, a territory, and an ambition that reached far beyond anything his father had originally planned for him. And it was during these 3 years that Cesare Borgia would become one of the most feared and most closely studied political figures of Renaissance Italy. Cesare's conquest of the Romagna, launched in 1499 with French troops and papal money behind him, moved with a speed and ruthlessness that stunned Italy. City after city fell: Imola, Forlì, Pesaro, Rimini. Local rulers who had governed for generations suddenly found themselves facing something they had never encountered before: a papally backed army equipped with French military support, superior artillery, enormous financial resources, and a commander willing to use fear as deliberately as force. Cesare was not simply conquering territory. He was dismantling an entire political order, and the people who stood closest to the Borgia family were discovering that they were not necessarily safer than its enemies. That became painfully clear in the case of Lucrezia's second husband, Alfonso of Aragon. After Lucrezia's first marriage to Giovanni Sforza was annulled, Alexander VI arranged a second marriage in 1498. Her new husband was Alfonso of Aragon, a member of the Neapolitan royal family. Unlike the Sforza marriage, this one appears to have developed into something much closer to a genuine relationship. The couple had a son, Rodrigo, within the first year. But politics was changing again. As Cesare's ambitions increasingly depended upon French support, the Borgias' relationship with the Neapolitan royal house became increasingly inconvenient, and Alfonso's greatest weakness was now the very thing that had once made him valuable: his bloodline. On July 15, 1500, Alfonso was attacked near St. Peter's Basilica. He was stabbed repeatedly and left for dead. But he survived. He was carried into the Vatican and spent weeks recovering, with Lucrezia reportedly remaining closely involved in his care. Then, on August 18th, the attack was finished. A group of armed men entered Alfonso's room. At the center of them was Micheletto Corella, one of Cesare's most trusted followers. Alfonso was strangled in his bed. Lucrezia was reportedly forced from the room. And once again, suspicion immediately turned toward Cesare. The official explanation was that Alfonso had previously attempted to assassinate Cesare. Few people in Rome found that explanation convincing. Whether Cesare personally ordered the murder remains impossible to establish with certainty. But the political result was undeniable. Another obstacle connected to Cesare's ambitions had disappeared, and by now, Rome was beginning to notice a pattern. Men who stood between Cesare and what he wanted had a remarkable tendency to die. But if Alfonso's death revealed the danger surrounding Cesare's family, what happened 2 years later at Senigallia revealed something even more important: how Cesare dealt with men powerful enough to threaten him directly. By the end of 1502, Cesare had conquered much of the Romagna. But his greatest military asset was also becoming his greatest danger. His army depended heavily on condottieri, professional mercenary commanders who were powerful political figures in their own right. These were not ordinary soldiers. They commanded their own troops. They possessed their own networks. And they understood that every city Cesare conquered made him less dependent upon them. If Cesare succeeded in establishing a centralized state in the Romagna, what need would he have for the mercenary captains who had helped him build it? Several of them began to fear that they would eventually be discarded. So they did something extremely dangerous. They conspired against him. The conspiracy brought together several of the most experienced commanders in Italy. For Cesare, this was potentially catastrophic. His army was the foundation of his state. If his own commanders turned against him, the entire Borgia project could collapse. But Cesare did not immediately attack. He negotiated. He offered reconciliation. He promised forgiveness. And he invited the conspirators to meet him at Senigallia under guarantees of safe conduct. The offer was convincing, perhaps too convincing. The conspirators accepted. In December 1502, they entered Senigallia. Cesare greeted them personally. He embraced them. He spoke to them as though the rebellion had been forgotten. The atmosphere appeared to be one of reconciliation. But the reconciliation was an act. Once the conspirators had entered the town and been separated from much of their own military support, Cesare made his move. They were seized. The trap had closed. 2 of the conspirators, Oliverotto da Fermo and Vitellozzo Vitelli, were strangled. Other conspirators were captured and subsequently executed. The significance of Senigallia was not simply that Cesare had defeated his enemies. He had defeated them without fighting them. He had taken men who were powerful enough to challenge him, persuaded them that they were safe, brought them within his reach, and then destroyed them before they understood what was happening. It was one of the clearest demonstrations of Cesare's political method. Patience first, deception second, violence last. And among the observers who witnessed Cesare's rise was a young Florentine diplomat. His name was Niccolò Machiavelli. Machiavelli encountered Cesare repeatedly during his diplomatic missions and watched closely as the Borgia transformed conquered territories into a functioning state. What fascinated him was not simply Cesare's brutality. It was his ability to combine brutality with administration. Cesare did not merely conquer cities. He appointed officials. He imposed order. He disciplined territory that had previously been plagued by feuding local rulers. He understood that terror could seize a city, but order was what allowed a ruler to keep it. Machiavelli would later make Cesare one of the most important examples in The Prince. But he did not present him simply as a hero. Cesare was a case study, a ruler who could be ruthless when necessary, generous when useful, deceptive when required, and decisive when hesitation threatened everything he had built. Machiavelli was fascinated by the political logic behind Cesare's actions. And there was one lesson above all others. A ruler could survive being feared. What he could not survive was becoming powerless. By the beginning of 1503, Cesare Borgia had achieved something that had seemed almost impossible only 4 years earlier. The former cardinal had become a territorial prince. He controlled much of the Romagna. He possessed a battle-hardened army. He had French support. He had his father's authority behind him. And across Italy, rulers who had once dismissed the Spanish cardinal now watched him with genuine fear. For the first time, Cesare seemed to be approaching the kind of power his father had always wanted for the Borgia family. A hereditary state, a permanent dynasty, a kingdom, perhaps, if circumstances continued to favor him. But Cesare had built almost everything he possessed on one foundation: his father's papacy. And in August 1503, that foundation was about to disappear. Alexander VI fell seriously ill. Within weeks, the man who had created Cesare's power would be dead. And suddenly, Cesare Borgia would have to discover whether the state he had built could survive without the Pope who had built it with him. In the second week of August 1503, both Alexander VI and Cesare Borgia fell seriously ill within days of one another after dining at a villa belonging to Cardinal Adriano Castellesi. The timing was almost too perfect. A pope and his son, two of the most powerful men in Italy, suddenly struck down together. And almost immediately, a story began spreading through Rome. They had been poisoned. The theory was irresistible. Perhaps a poisoned bottle of wine had been intended for someone else. Perhaps the Borgias themselves had been the intended targets. Perhaps the poisoner had simply made a catastrophic mistake and poisoned the wrong table. For more than 5 centuries, that story has survived. But the evidence is far less dramatic. Rome in August was a notoriously unhealthy place. Malaria and other fevers were endemic around the city's marshy lowlands, and summer epidemics regularly killed people regardless of their political importance. Other members of Alexander's household also became sick around the same time, as did several cardinals with no obvious connection to any poisoning plot. Alexander was 72 years old. Cesare was only 28. Both had fallen violently ill at roughly the same moment. The simultaneous illness certainly leaves room for speculation, but the evidence does not establish poisoning. Modern historians generally regard an infectious illness, possibly malaria or another severe fever, as a more plausible explanation than the elaborate poisoning story that later became part of Borgia legend. Whatever caused it, the result was the same. Alexander VI died on August 18, 1503. Exactly 11 years earlier, almost to the day, he had been elected pope. Now he was dead, and Cesare was lying gravely ill nearby. He was too sick to attend his father's final moments, too weak to organize his government, too weak to command his army, and most importantly, too weak to protect the empire his father had spent years helping him build. The timing could hardly have been worse. Everything Cesare possessed depended upon one foundation: the authority of the Pope. Alexander had given him titles. Alexander had legitimized his conquests. Alexander had provided the money and political machinery that made those conquests possible. And Alexander's position as Pope had given Cesare's territorial ambitions a legal justification that brute military force alone could never provide. Remove Alexander, and the entire structure became vulnerable. Only weeks earlier, Cesare had seemed almost untouchable. He had conquered much of the Romagna. He had defeated his own mercenary commanders at Senegalia. He possessed an army. He possessed territory. And men like Machiavelli were studying him as one of the most formidable political operators in Italy. Now compare that man with Cesare in the third week of August. He was a fever-racked 28-year-old, confined to his bed, while the Pope who had created his power lay dead. And while Cesare could barely move, everyone around him understood what Alexander's death meant. The Romagna began to unravel. Almost immediately, local rulers who had been driven from their territories began returning. Cities reconsidered their allegiance. Garrisons that had depended on Borgia money and military protection began negotiating their own survival. The state Cesare had spent 4 years building had looked remarkably solid, but much of its strength had been personal. People obeyed because Cesare was there. They feared because Cesare could punish them. They cooperated because Cesare's army was behind him. Now Cesare was lying helpless, and the entire system began coming apart with astonishing speed. This exposed the fundamental weakness of the Borgia project. Cesare had built a state. But he had not yet built institutions strong enough to survive the disappearance of the man at its center. His power was immense, but it was also dangerously dependent upon individuals. Alexander, Cesare, the French army. Remove enough of those pieces, and the whole structure could collapse. Cesare eventually recovered enough to return to Rome. But by then, the political world had already begun moving without him. The cardinals gathered to elect Alexander's successor. And Cesare still had one enormous problem. Whoever became pope would inherit the power to destroy everything his father had built for him. Cesare therefore did what he had done throughout his career. He negotiated, he used what influence remained to him, and he supported a compromise candidate who appeared willing to preserve his position and recognize at least some of his territorial gains. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Cesare might survive the transition. But there was a problem. The man who emerged from the conclave was Francesco Todeschini Piccolomini, who took the name Pius III. He was elderly and already seriously ill. His reign would last only 26 days. And when Pius III died, the real threat to Cesare finally arrived. The man who had spent years opposing the Borgias was about to take the throne of St. Peter. His name was Giuliano della Rovere, and he had been waiting for this moment for years. He would become Pope Julius II. For Cesare Borgia, the most dangerous enemy he had ever made was no longer merely a cardinal plotting against his family. He was now the Pope. And unlike Alexander VI, Julius had absolutely no intention of preserving the Borgia state. The man who had helped build Cesare's empire was dead. The man who wanted to destroy it had just become Pope. Della Rovere's hostility toward Alexander's family was not merely political. He had spent years opposing Rodrigo, had left Rome during Alexander's pontificate for fear of the Borgia faction, and had every reason to dismantle the political structure his rival had built. Now he had the one position from which he could do it. He was Pope. Cesare, still recovering from his illness, tried to negotiate. He offered his cooperation to Julius II in return for protection of his remaining territories and position. But whatever assurances may have been discussed, Cesare's fundamental problem was now impossible to escape. His power depended on the Pope, and the Pope was no longer his father. Julius II moved against him. Cesare was arrested, his titles and claims were stripped away, and the political machinery that had sustained his Romagna state began to collapse. City after city slipped from Borgia control. Imola, Forlì, Pesaro, Rimini, and the other territories Cesare had conquered were recovered by the papacy, or reclaimed by their former rulers. The state that had taken Cesare 4 years to build was disappearing in months, and the irony was brutal. Cesare had spent his career making other men powerless through force. Now, without his father's authority, and without an army capable of resisting the papacy, he had almost no power of his own left to use. The man who had orchestrated the trap at Senigallia was arrested without anything resembling a final stand. His army was gone. His territories were gone. His father's protection was gone. And the extraordinary political machine the Borgias had constructed around the papacy had finally turned against the man who had depended upon it most. Cesare was eventually transferred into Spanish custody and imprisoned, first in Italy and later in Spain, including at the fortress of Chinchilla and the castle of La Mota. But imprisonment could not hold him forever. In 1506, Cesare escaped from captivity, reportedly descending from a tower by rope before making his way to Navarre, where his brother-in-law, King John III, offered him a military command. It was a remarkable reversal. Only a few years earlier, Cesare had been a duke, a cardinal turned prince, commander of papal armies, and master of a growing state in central Italy. Now he possessed no territory of his own, no army of his own, no papal office, no father to protect him. What remained was the one thing nobody could strip from him: his ability to command soldiers, And in Navarre, that was enough to give him one final opportunity. It would also be his last. On March 12, 1507, Cesare Borgia was killed near the town of Viana in Navarre while pursuing enemy forces. Separated from much of his own support, he was ambushed and cut down in the fighting. He was 31 years old. The man who had once seemed destined to build a Borgia principality capable of reshaping Italy had died fighting in a war far from the Romagna, not as a pope's son commanding a vast army, but as a military commander serving his brother-in-law. And there was an extraordinary irony in the way he died. Cesare had become famous for calculation, for patience, for deception, for understanding exactly when to strike and when to wait. Machiavelli had studied him precisely because he seemed to embody the qualities required for a prince to survive in a world where hesitation could mean destruction. Yet Cesare's own life ended with something much simpler, a battlefield mistake. He had survived conspiracies, political betrayals, sieges, rival armies, and the collapse of his father's papacy. But on an ordinary stretch of road outside Viana, he advanced too far with too few men, and the prince who had once made Italy fear his name was dead. The Borgia Empire had lasted barely a decade, but the family story was not over, because Alexander VI was dead, Cesare was dead, the Romagna state was gone, and yet Lucrezia Borgia was still alive. And unlike her father and brother, she was about to discover that survival in the Borgia family did not always mean disappearing into obscurity. Sometimes it meant becoming something far more unexpected, a respected Renaissance ruler in her own right. While her father and brother built and lost an empire through conquest, calculation, and violence, Lucrezia Borgia was quietly writing the one genuinely redemptive chapter in her family's entire story. In early 1502, before either Alexander's death or Cesare's final downfall, Lucrezia married for a third time, this time to Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara, one of the most cultured and sophisticated courts in Renaissance Italy. The match began, like the Borgia marriages before it, as political calculation. Ferrara needed protection. The Borgias needed legitimacy. And Alfonso's family reportedly had serious reservations about accepting a woman whose name had become synonymous with the scandals of Alexander VI's papacy. Lucrezia was 21 years old, already twice married, already a mother, and already carrying the weight of almost every rumor Rome had ever attached to her family. Consider what she was actually walking into. Her first marriage had ended in a humiliating annulment after Giovanni Sforza was pressured to declare himself impotent. Her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, had been brutally murdered after surviving an earlier assassination attempt, a killing widely associated with Cesare, though the exact circumstances remain debated. And hanging over everything were the sensational stories of incest and sexual corruption that had transformed the Borgia name into a byword for Renaissance depravity. None of those stories has ever been established as fact, but by 1502, that distinction hardly mattered. Lucrezia arrived in Ferrara, carrying a reputation she had not created herself, and entering a court that had every reason to be suspicious of her. Nobody expected what happened next, because in Ferrara, Lucrezia's life changed. She gradually established herself not as the scandalous Borgia daughter Rome had imagined, but as a respected duchess and an important figure at one of the great cultural courts of the Italian Renaissance. She became a patron of poets, musicians, and scholars. She participated in court life with increasing confidence and discretion, while maintaining an extensive correspondence and cultivating relationships with some of the leading intellectuals of her age. And, perhaps most importantly, she built a stable family life. Lucrezia and Alfonso had several children who survived infancy, and over the years she became increasingly integrated into the Este dynasty. The young woman who had once been moved from marriage to marriage according to her father's political calculations had, at last, entered a household in which she could build something of her own. That doesn't mean the rest of her life was easy. Pregnancies repeatedly endangered her health. Her duties as duchess were demanding. Ferrara itself stood in a dangerous position between France, the papacy, Venice, and the other competing powers of Italy. And the shadow of her family never completely disappeared. But the crucial difference was that Lucrezia no longer needed to be defined by Rome's version of the Borgias. She had become someone else. By the time of her death, the woman who had once been portrayed as the poisonous daughter of the most notorious pope in Europe had become a respected duchess, mother, patron, and member of one of Italy's most prestigious ruling houses. Lucrezia died in June 1519, at just 39 years old, from complications following the birth of her 8th child. Her death was genuinely mourned at Ferrara, and that is perhaps the most revealing ending to her story. The woman who had spent her youth being used as a political instrument by the Borgia family ultimately built the most enduring personal legacy of any of Alexander VI's children. Cesare died in an obscure battlefield ambush. Giovanni was murdered under circumstances that remain unresolved. Alexander died with the dynasty he had tried to build already beginning to collapse. But Lucrezia survived long enough to become something her father and brother never managed to be. A Borgia whose reputation was no longer dependent on power. Within a generation of Alexander VI's death, the Borgia name had become a byword for corruption, poison, and ruthless ambition across Europe, a reputation cemented in no small part by hostile chroniclers and rival political factions who had every reason to blacken the family's name, and whose accounts still shape much of the popular image of the Borgias today. But the bloodline itself did not simply disappear into infamy. In one branch, it went somewhere almost nobody watching the family's scandal-soaked rise could have predicted. Giovanni Borgia, the murdered Duke of Gandia, had left behind a young son who inherited his title. That son's own son, Alexander VI's great-grandson, carrying the same line whose founder had been stabbed and thrown into the Tiber in 1497, was named Francis. Raised at the Spanish royal court, married young, and eventually appointed Viceroy of Catalonia, Francis Borgia seemed destined for exactly the kind of worldly aristocratic life his great-grandfather had spent decades building for his descendants. Then, in 1546, his wife died, and Francis Borgia walked away from everything. He renounced his dukedom, surrendered his wealth, and entered the Society of Jesus, the newly founded Jesuit order that was then barely 2 decades old. He eventually became its 3rd superior general, overseeing its extraordinary expansion across Europe and into the wider world. He died in 1572, revered by Catholics for a life of humility and devotion that seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the family name he carried. And in 1670, nearly 2 centuries after Alexander VI's death, the Church canonized Francis Borgia as a saint. Think about the irony. The same family whose most notorious member was accused of purchasing the papacy with money had, within a few generations, produced a man the Catholic Church itself would hold up as a model of Christian virtue. The Borgia story, however, leaves behind one final and much stranger legacy. In the 18th century, an Italian cardinal named Stefano Borgia, not a direct descendant of the Renaissance Borgias, but a member of the same extended family name, became an extraordinary collector of historical artifacts. Among the objects he acquired was a remarkable pre-Columbian manuscript painted on deerskin by Mixtec artists in what is now Mexico. Created before the Spanish conquest, it survived the destruction of much of the indigenous world, crossed the Atlantic, and eventually entered the collection of an Italian cardinal. Today, it is preserved in the Vatican Library, and it is known as the Codex Borgia. The manuscript has nothing to do with Alexander VI, Cesare, or Lucrezia. Yet, almost by accident, the Borgia name is now permanently attached to one of the most important surviving records of pre-Columbian Mesoamerican civilization. It is an almost perfect final irony for a family whose reputation has survived far beyond the people who created it. So what actually explains the extraordinary rise of the House of Borgia? The honest answer is that almost nothing they did was unique. Nepotism, political marriages, mistresses, simony, intrigue, territorial conquest, even political murder. None of these were Borgia inventions. Renaissance Italy was already a world in which popes behaved like princes, princes behaved like warlords, and political alliances could change with breathtaking speed. Other families used the same methods, sometimes with just as much ruthlessness. What made the Borgias different was the concentration of all those methods inside a single family, and the extraordinary speed with which they turned papal power into dynastic power. Within less than half a century, two members of the same family occupied the throne of St. Peter. One of them used the papacy to elevate his relatives. The other used it to build a territorial state for his son. And for a brief, astonishing moment, it seemed possible that the Borgias might transform the papacy itself into the foundation of a hereditary Italian dynasty. They failed. Alexander died. Cesare's state collapsed. Giovanni was murdered. Lucrezia outlived the worst of the family's political ambitions and built a very different life in Ferrara. And eventually, the dynasty they had tried to construct dissolved into the wider aristocracy of Europe. But the name remained. The Borgias did not invent the corruption of Renaissance politics. They became its most unforgettable symbol. And perhaps that is why, 5 centuries later, their story still refuses to disappear.